Or joining online, which is very conventional, so hopefully there are lots of you out there. The Institute for Government's delighted to be hosting this event in partnership with Queen's University Belfast and with the support of the Economic and Social Research Council. I'm Jo Rutter, I'm a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government. Today we're looking at the Northern Ireland Protocol, and in particular what people in Northern Ireland think about the protocol and the impact it's having on their day-to-day life. We know what the UK government thinks about the protocol, we know what quite a lot of Conservative MPs think about the protocol, and we hear what Northern Ireland politicians think about the protocol. But I'm delighted today that our colleagues are going to share some recent polling on what the public in Northern Ireland think about the protocol. So just to run you through the format. We're going to kick off with a presentation by Professor Katie Hayward. Katie is Professor of Political Sociology at Queen's University Belfast and a Senior Fellow at UK and a Changing Europe. We've then got three more very distinguished panellists to discuss those results with. They are Professor David Finnemore, Professor of European Politics and the coordinator of the ESRC-funded research project on governance for a place between the multi-level dynamics of implementing the protocol in Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is really quite an academic title for something, I think, but anyway. Then, over there on my far right, is Raoul Roperol, former Europe Special Advisor to David Davis as Brexit Secretary, and then Theresa May as Prime Minister, now Director of Trade and Investment at Deloitte, but critically, a man who's established something of a reputation as the person who forecasts where landing zones might be found on the Northern Ireland Protocol. So we might get some more insights from Raoul today if he's channeling his inner Liz Truss. And last but by absolutely no means least, the IFG's own expert Northern Ireland watcher and frequent appearer on Northern Ireland broadcast media, Jess Sargent. So that's the lineup. Please do post questions. I'll take questions from in the room, but I'm very keen that everybody watching online has as good an experience as the people here, even if they don't get a coffee cup. They might get better coffee at home, frankly. But please do put in your questions on Slido. If you want to tweet along, we think the hashtag is IFG Brexit, so tweet along to that. We will, of course, be live tweeting from @IFG events. So this is the moment of truth when I say, let Katie and the slides please work. So over to you, Katie, and it's a real pleasure to have colleagues who we've only sort of communed with online from Belfast actually here in London today. Katie.
Thank you very much, Jill. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks to IFG for hosting us. So yes, I will use my technological solutions to be able to present the latest findings from our poll. So this poll is part of the project that's already mentioned that David leads upon. And this is the fourth poll that we've conducted with Lucid Talk. So basically this is an online opinion panel poll, and the results that we are showing is based on a weighted sample of just over 1,500 people, and it's representative of the adult voting population in Northern Ireland, and there's a margin of error of plus or minus 2.3%. So I'm just going to give you the headlines here. Please go to our website if you want to see more of the data tables and a report that we've co-authored with Lisa Whitten on the results. So because this is a time series poll, basically we're able to look back at what's happened over the past year or so. Our first poll was published in March last year. We're able to ask the same questions and then some different ones. So this is this first set of questions is one that we've asked since the very beginning, so we can map changes that have happened over time in terms of opinion on the poll. And to put it very simply, what's happened since March and June is an increase in people thinking that the protocol is on balance a good thing. However, you can see that there's a very strong proportion of our respondents who still think negatively about the protocol. A couple of key points to bear in mind is that still we have a majority thinking that Brexit is on balance a bad thing for Northern Ireland, but most consistently across the whole time series we've seen at least around 2/3 of people thinking that Northern Ireland always needed particular arrangements out of Brexit. Whether they think the protocol is appropriate or not is a matter of disagreement. One significant change since June has been, previously we had a high number of people who were undecided on it, and it was more or less even split about those who thought it was good and bad, and we have seen people move now towards thinking on balance it's a good thing, so just around half of people now. That's possibly due to people looking across the water over here and seeing the impact of Brexit here, perhaps. I will leave this up for a little while so you can work it out. This is the simplest way we thought to show you. So essentially, we were asking people around how they're experiencing the protocol at the time of asking. I should say that this poll was conducted at the beginning of February. It's at the end of a notable week for the protocol in which Minister Edwin Poots ordered checks to stop on agri-food products coming into Northern Ireland. And the next day, Paul Givan resigned as First Minister, reportedly over the protocol as well. So it was very much in the news. Possibly unsurprising, therefore, that the majority of people, as with our previous polls, think that the protocol is having a negative impact on political stability in Northern Ireland. This has been consistent finding in our poll. Also consistent from the beginning of last year when we started our polling is the view that the protocol has a negative impact on British-Irish relations and on UK-EU relations. What has changed, and you can see this reflected here, is a move since last October's poll towards a majority of people thinking that the protocol is actually good for the economy, its impact on the economy of Northern Ireland is good. And also more people are thinking that it's good for the protection of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement as well. So what you can see in this line, I'm not sure, I'm totally out of practice in using this now. No, that's not going to work. But essentially you can see just the movement is towards the positives, but overall the big picture is red, so still in the negative sense overall of the impact of the protocol across those areas, even though there's a shift towards moving towards a more positive view. Another question that we ask every time is, who do you trust to manage Northern Ireland's interests when it comes to the protocol? And we've also asked about the different parties, not just Sinn Féin and the DUP. The headline finding from this is consistently, people don't trust anybody to handle Northern Ireland's interests on the protocol, with the exception of business representatives in Northern Ireland. And this figure for them has steadily grown over the course of the year. So that's very notable. When asked why, I would suspect partly it's because when they're speaking on the topic in public, they are speaking with evidence and with facts. They're giving explanation of the experience of the protocol, and generally speaking, they're speaking quite reasonably too. So people do trust them on that regard. They don't tend to trust the political parties. If you ask about the Northern Ireland Executive, they don't trust the Northern Ireland Executive. With respect to trust in the in the Irish government and the EU Commission, there's a split on this. You might imagine where the split comes when you look at in more detail at people's views with respect to that question. But consistently since the very beginning, trust in the UK government has been between 4% and 6%. It's at 4% again in this poll. And it's not just that people don't trust the British government, they distrust them. Over half of respondents distrust them a lot. And I think this helps us understand the connection to concerns around political stability and concerns around the protocol more generally as well. And we think about the context in which the protocol was developed. That's very notable. You will recall that there's a democratic consent vote, so-called, at the end of 2024, that members of the Legislative Assembly, whether it's sitting or not, will have to vote on the application of Articles 5 to 10 in the protocol. These in general relate to the so-called Irish Sea border. This is an interesting one. So you can see here how it's changed over the course of our polling. So we've seen now, since October, a majority saying that they'd like their MLAs to vote for full application of the protocol, i.e. not suspending Articles 5 to 10 or having them rewritten or revised. And you can see from the results there, it's not really that people have moved, those who are against it have moved. It's really that those who had no preference or no view on it have actually moved towards thinking they want the protocol fully implemented. And then last but not least, we asked a set of questions in this poll that we haven't asked before, and with sort of agree-disagree statements. And I've just selected some of them here for you. One thing when we asked about people's concerns with respect to the protocol that has consistently come throughout the polls have been the lack of Northern Ireland's representation in the management of the protocol. When we asked them whether there should be formalised structures to hear directly from business and civil society in Northern Ireland, this was the question that most people agreed with. And then a couple of other questions that we have a clear majority in agreement with, or statements rather. A failure by the UK and EU to agree soon a solution to the outstanding issues regarding the protocol would undermine peace and stability in Northern Ireland. This shows the pressure on those talks at the UK-EU level, even if people have very low opinions of their ability to trust the UK government in that, and some people don't trust the EU on that. They do realise that those talks are really significant, or think they're very significant to peace and stability. Interestingly enough, a clear majority also think that Northern Ireland could have unique opportunities, economically speaking, arising from the protocol, which potentially could benefit Northern Ireland. And we see people from across different political viewpoints agreeing with this particular statement, which I think is very interesting. A majority think that the UK government should prioritise upholding its international treaty obligations, including under the protocol, in all circumstances. Related to that, perhaps, a majority disagree that the UK government would be justified were it to trigger Article 16. However, we do see 4 out of 10 people thinking that it would be justified if it was to trigger Article 16. And last but not least, something that we're very conscious of is the lack of confidence in the reliable information available on the protocol in Northern Ireland in particular. And so only 21% think that the print and broadcast media in Northern Ireland can be relied upon to provide balanced coverage of political and economic developments with respect to the protocol. So we come back to that question of where do people get their information on with respect to the protocol, how are their views formed? And these views, as we can see from our polling across the year, are very strongly held and politically significant when it comes to their choice of candidate in the upcoming elections.
Thank you very much, Katie. Katie, we've got one technical question. We've got some questions coming in. I'm noting that Anonymous is either extraordinarily active or a lot of people want to conceal their identities. Either is fine, delighted to have you, but if you do want to tell us who you are, that's even more interesting. Just got a sort of technical question on the polling from Anonymous, who is asking whether the poll is a series of, who's assuming that it's a series of cross-sections rather than a standing panel. That's right, isn't it? That these are, you know, representative samples, but they're not the same sample you go back to time and time again.
So it's an opinion panel, so there's over 13,000 on that panel. So the opportunity to answer the poll goes to all 13,000. And then we have had different numbers, over 2,000 each time. The last response was over 3,000 people. So we don't know exactly whether that's exactly the same as you answered the previous poll, and then the representative sample is taken from whoever obviously answers that particular poll.
Hopefully Anonymous is happy with that answer. So a question, Jess, which was from Anonymous too, which was actually very similar to the question I was about to ask you. Anonymous has asked, can you give a brief summary of the implementation of the protocol so far? So where do things stand, both on actual implementation of the protocol, but also on the negotiations that we see happening almost weekly between Liz Truss and Maros Šefčovič?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the protocol as it is written has not been fully implemented. So when we talk about the impact the protocol has had on trade or on business, really we don't know the true impact because we haven't seen it fully implemented. Quite a lot of the customs aspects have been implemented, and the UK government has given a lot of support for business through the Trader Support Service, which is why we seem to be quite successful and quite helpful. That aspect has gone fairly smoothly, although there are problems that the UK wants to see resolved. But on the the agri-food side on these sanitary and phytosanitary checks, which will be the most, will require the most onerous checks, essentially, because they're required on lots of products that might be sold in supermarkets, and there's the potential to disrupt supply chains. On those, the UK and the EU agreed a grace period, which has since been extended by the UK government. So we're actually seeing quite a low level of those checks taking place at the moment. And then since then, we've also had Edwin Poots, who has called to halt some of those checks where they were taking place, although there's that currently issue is in the courts as to whether the civil servants should comply with that order. So that's on the kind of implementation side. I mean, the reason why there's been it's not been fully implemented is because the UK is now is seeking changes, and there are these ongoing discussions between the UK and the EU. There has been some progress on some issues like medicines. It seems that there are some commonly found solutions in that area, but on things like the level of checks and controls, there's still a high level of disagreement between the UK and the EU. The EU has put forward proposals to try and minimise those checks. The UK still doesn't think that that is enough, and ultimately their position is that any good that is going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and remaining in Northern Ireland shouldn't be subject to checks, and a similar principle they would argue on the customs. There's also a whole other a set of issues like the role of the European Court of Justice, the application of the EU state aid regime in Northern Ireland, some issues around VAT, where the EU is not particularly receptive to discussing potential changes to the protocol in those areas. So although with a change from Lord Frost to Liz Truss, we've seen a slightly more positive tone, we've seen more joint statements, the practical issues to be resolved are still quite difficult, and we haven't got a deal quite yet.
Katie, just a question here to pick up what Jess was saying about the fact that we actually haven't really experienced the protocol red in tooth and claw yet. Terence Wright's asked how useful it is actually to seek opinions on the protocol when people actually haven't experienced it. Do people in Northern Ireland know that the protocol's not fully implemented yet?
So that's a good question. So we did test knowledge of the protocol, and it's not as good as possibly people think their understanding of the protocol is. However, it absolutely is important to test people's opinions of it, because it is front, left and centre of a lot of the political debate at the moment, and has been since the beginning of last year. People are beginning to experience it, not in the kind of empty shelves kind of way, but in the smaller ways, such as certain goods not being available from Britain as they might have been before, etc.
And just a quick follow-up question before I come to David. When the UK was experiencing those shortages in the autumn, and we were all saying, was it COVID, was it Brexit? I think UK Interchange Europe, we produced a piece on, is it COVID, is it Brexit? Did Northern Ireland sit there rather smugly and say, mainland problem, we're sort of okay, maybe this protocol thing's not so bad after all? Did that affect public opinion at all? Or?
Yes, I suspect it did. So our last poll was in October, and it happened after the headlines around the shortages here. And we did see a big leap, particularly on the economic impact. People think it was having a positive impact on the economy of Northern Ireland. I'm sure it must be related to that. And some of the comments put forward too. We asked for people's comments, which Lisa Whitten analyses, and that was very clear that that was a sense as well that people had.
Okay, David, I wanted to come on to onto that. Katie's presented those sorts of results. If you were coming and saying to UK negotiators, this is where public opinion is in Northern Ireland, what do you think they should particularly take note of? What should they make of these results?
I think the starting point is picking up on a lot of the red that Katie showed. Is there's still huge division over the protocol and over Brexit. But equally, when we look across the four polls, we're seeing the majority of people in Northern Ireland accepting you probably do need particular arrangements for Northern Ireland. That if you get the protocol to work, you resolve some of the outstanding issues, then 2/3 of people think there could be opportunities there. There's lots of contingencies here. But I think that the message there, I think, should be, okay, well, keep working to try and find the resolution to the outstanding issues, because there is broad support for the protocol if it can be made to work. I think also we need to recognise that there are multiple concerns that people have. Jess raised a number of them there. But across the polls, the 2 polls we've done, it's been clear what the key priorities are. The medicines is a real priority issue. So it's good to note there's a reasonable amount of progress being made towards a solution there. They're very concerned about creating voice for Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland voice being heard in the development of the UK government's position, in the debates and discussions between the UK and the EU. So those, I think, are some of the issues which, if you focused on, you may then be able to get that support coming in for the protocol and alleviate some of the concerns of other people. What the concerns aren't necessarily around the Court of Justice question. They're not really around the diversion of goods question. So there's a clear sense as to what the priority issues should be. I think a third point I'd take away is, okay, it relates to that trust question. Okay, whatever you do has now got to be sold to the people in Northern Ireland. I think there needs to be a lot of thinking done into how you actually convert that distrust into a sense of trust that this is a set of arrangements that could work longer term. I'm not sure how you do that, because I think despite the efforts of the UK government and over the last year to try and show that they're prioritising concerns of people in Northern Ireland, that trust figure is not moving. And that is a real concern here.
That's very interesting. And you actually showed that there's quite a relatively high level of trust in the European Commission, the Irish government compared to, is that just the sort of, is that just people who always opposed Brexit in Northern Ireland, who thinks Brexit's a mistake, just saying, well, actually, the Europeans, they get it and we don't trust them?
I think what you have to realise is, okay, some people will say, okay, well, people who identify as nationalists are probably going to be far more supportive and trust in the Irish government and the Commission. Remainers will probably trust in the Commission. What you've rarely have in Northern Ireland society is trust in the UK government. And I don't think it's just a problem around the protocol. It's around a lot of other issues. So there's something systemic there which you've got to try and overcome.
That's really, really interesting. I'm going to take a similar question. I want to come back to some of these questions about how actually you could give voice and things like that to people in Northern Ireland. Raoul, if you were still a special advisor in government, or you're brought back in, and Liz Truss says, well, I haven't had much time this week, other things are going on, but you've seen these poll results, what messages do you think the UK negotiators should take out of this?
Yeah, well, I think it highlights, as David said, that the positions are very entrenched, the consistency throughout the polls. I think it is clearly very divided. I think fundamentally, my takeaway is, even though there are slight majorities or sometimes reasonable majorities in favour of certain parts and the protocol, you still have very sizable minorities against. And I think, we look back at the history of Northern Ireland, it's a history of quite large minorities having to be taken into account. And so I think that continues to be something the UK government is trying to take account of, and I would obviously continue to support that. I do think Jess's point about the fact that the protocol isn't fully implemented yet is an important one, because if you tie that in with people not actually knowing and the knowledge of the protocol being quite low when they're asked questions about it, you kind of have a weird space we're in now where people might think the protocol is being implemented, but it's not what they think it is, and it's not fully implemented. So I'm a bit cautious about drawing too many concrete from these polls until we fully see the protocol being in place. Although I would be interested to see future questions about, do people understand to what extent the protocol is being implemented? I mean, my personal view is it's probably more than the EU says it is, but less than the UK says it is. So, there is quite a lot of it being implemented, but it clearly isn't the whole thing. How much people in Northern Ireland understand that, I don't know. I think that is an important point. So I think, but for me, the biggest thing is, the election coming up. And at the moment, I just think it's very hard to draw any conclusions until we see the outcome of the election and how things look afterwards. I mean, anything the UK government or the EU puts on the table ahead of the election will probably be slammed from at least one side, if not both sides. The Unionist sides are very likely to take a dim view of anything, because that's the position they're taking into the election. And therefore, I don't see the incentive ahead of them to really make any kind of concessions or moves. In the aftermath, we'll see how it looks, but obviously the polls suggest it is going to change, and as some of the polling here has showed, people are factoring in the protocol in their votes, and it will have an impact. I think, though, it's going to be quite a confused picture. You will probably have a slightly larger sort of pro-protocol majority in the Assembly, potentially, but equally, you have a very entrenched minority, and you will have a very difficult situation in getting the Assembly and the Executive back up and running. And so coming from that position then gives the minority, the quite sizable minority, quite an influential role. So yeah, I think it's going to be a very difficult situation, and I think the biggest conclusions have to be drawn from the election result and where we land in the aftermath there, and see if there is a pathway through. But at the moment, it feels to me we're kind of in a bit of a limbo stalemate for at least a few months, if not longer. Does anyone want to dissent from the fact that we're in a limbo stalemate until the elections? Jess, the government and the DUP talk a lot about Article 16 and the need to trigger Article 16. Would that actually make any immediate difference to anything on the ground apart from raising the temperature between the UK and the EU? I mean, substantively, does it change anything very much?
I think it's very unclear what exactly triggering Article 16 would look like in practice from the UK government's perspective. It's not something they necessarily elaborated on in the command paper. In fact, they said they might use it to extend the grace periods, which has been done anyway. So there's a lot of ambiguity about what exactly it means. It could be that they suspend customs checks or something like that, some of the elements of the protocol that are in force, but it's not clear what practical implication that would have. I think it really is more of a negotiating tool, essentially. And there was a big concern around the end of last year that the UK government might be ready to trigger Article 16, and certainly they would argue that the threshold for doing so, which is that kind of serious societal or environmental difficulties that are liable to persist, or trade diversion, they would argue that has been met, and therefore it's a threat that is still on the table. I think the UK government's position in that sense hasn't changed, even if it feels less likely. But aside from playing into that negotiations, it's not clear what difference it would make on the ground. And it's not a long-term solution. You know, the protocol is very clear that Article 16 measures are meant to be time limited and to address a specific problem that had been identified, not this kind of catch-all tool to try and get rid of the obligations. And actually, one of the things I noted from the poll is that there was an understanding amongst the majority of people in Northern Ireland that Article 16 wouldn't just make the protocol go away or completely resolve the issue. So I think certainly at this time, while we're waiting for the election, kind of any talking up of the use of Article 16 is just fundamentally unhelpful, and hopefully that they'll use this time and this space, the UK and the EU, to try and address some of the practical difficulties and get closer to a solution.
So people online are posting in lots of questions. So if anyone in the room wants to ask a question, do pitch in. But I'm going to go to an online question from Jim, and please upvote questions. This is our top voted question. Katie. Jim's asked, the DUP always say they speak for the people of Northern Ireland. Geoffrey Donaldson, Jim suggests, opens most of his interviews by saying that. Is that legitimate to say that in the light of these results? If Geoffrey Donaldson were reading your poll, I don't know whether he's a big fan of your polling, would he be able to say, well, actually, maybe I need to do a bit of a double take because maybe I'm not quite speaking for the people of Northern Ireland there?
I mean, the thing about Northern Ireland is even the First Minister doesn't speak for everybody in Northern Ireland. You know, this is why we have a First and Deputy First Minister of equal standing, at least in theory. I mean, one thing, just to pick up on what Raoul was saying, there isn't such a thing as a unionist position. One thing that we can see from this data is there is a wide range of views, or a fairly wide range of views amongst unionists themselves. And also people from different parts of Northern Ireland. And you can even see that, of course, in the results of the referendum itself back in 2016. I think there is, so a lot of the British government's comments recently, including the Prime Minister's, have been ones that have echoed concerns or reiterated concerns from the DUP. But it is clear that the views of DUP supporters are not those held by even necessarily the majority of people in Northern Ireland. So whilst there are concerns, as David has said, the particular concerns of DUP supporters are not necessarily exactly those of others. We can see this when we ask about levels of concern around constitutional status around the protocol. For the majority of people, and this is found in other polls as well, the protocol is not the top issue.
Okay, it's quite interesting because we've got another question from another anonymous. about the extent to, have you evaluated the extent to which the opposition to the protocol is fundamentally constitutional and one of democratic consent versus economic, and the suggestion is that such core position is unlikely to change no matter what softening of terms may be agreed. David, do you think, you talked a bit about representation and the needs for that. Obviously that's quite complicated with, if I was in the EEA, I don't get much representation in EU decisions. It's quite hard to see how you would concede much more to a constituent part of the UK which has decided to formally leave. But, are there things that actually could convince people in Northern Ireland that some of those legitimate democratic concerns are being addressed?
I think a number of things that we found in the polling was that the vast majority of people do not actually know that Northern Ireland is present as part of the UK delegation when it's attending meetings of the Joint Committee, the Specialised Committee, or what's called the Joint Consultative Working Group. That's just not known, whereas Northern Ireland is part of those delegations. Also, I think, you made the point about the European Economic Area. As part of the protocol arrangements, there is quite a privileged information exchange forum, this Joint Consultative Working Group, which I would actually say does provide opportunity for Northern Ireland, if it formulates a voice and gets it represented through the UK government, to have an input on issues to do with the protocol. So we probably need to create greater awareness of those mechanisms. What we also need to do is make sure that they actually work. And I think one of the problems we've got at the moment is with the institutions of the protocol, they're not meeting on a regular basis. The Joint Committee met last week. It was meant to meet 4 times this last year. It's met once. Okay, the Specialised Committee I don't think has met since September time. Okay, so I think if you had the situation where you almost sort of normalised the institutions, had them up and running, and you had some reporting on them and you got familiarity with them, then you might have a sense that the Northern Ireland voice is being fed through. I think also what we've seen is, the issue of medicines was raised. And by all accounts, what the EU has put forward goes a considerable way to addressing the concerns which exist. But that's not necessarily been flagged. It's interesting the way in which I think people were split, I think about 45, on whether the EU proposal around medicines was too little too late. Whereas I think if you talk to industry, most of them say, well, actually, it goes a very long way to addressing our concerns. So part of it is there not being reliable information around about what's actually happening with the protocol. That's not to say there aren't serious concerns still there, but we possibly are focusing more on the concerns rather than some of the genuine efforts that have been made or could be made to address some of those concerns.
I'm really interested with what difference it's made. We saw David Frost, who was the sort of lead UK negotiator, the architect of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, was, if not a fan of the protocol, was there as chief negotiator when the protocol was negotiated and signed by Boris Johnson. Over here, it looks to us as though there's, at the very least, an improvement in the mood music with the transfer to Liz Truss. Maybe that's just because of her sort of savvier Instagram presence. Maybe it's sort of substantive. But in Northern Ireland, what's it feel like? I mean, David Frost was dedicated full-time Mr. Brexit. Liz Truss, frankly, has got quite a lot of other stuff to do. The Minister of State was Minister of State for about 4 weeks, and then was taken off to be Chief Whip in the reshuffle there. I mean, do you get the sense that the Truss team is engaging in Northern Ireland in the same way as maybe the Frost team was? Because we've seen, Maroš Šefčovič make a lot of the fact that he is talking to Northern Ireland business. He is representing the real concerns of Northern Ireland people, with the implicit criticism that the UK is failing to do that. Does that resonate in Northern Ireland? How did it feel from you over there?
I think it's still early days on this. I think there's certainly a sense that there was a mood change, but at the moment we've not necessarily seen the product of that, any real move towards actually resolving the issue. But I think, there is a serious concern there, to the extent to which Liz Truss has the bandwidth to deal with the Northern Ireland issue, because it is highly complex. There are a lot of moving parts to it, and there's a lot to manage, particularly in an election year. One, I think, can only be optimistic that mood change does actually deliver some substantive movement, such that you do actually move towards resolving the issues, because obviously people are concerned about the implications on the political stability in Northern Ireland if you don't resolve these issues, which are currently causing so much concern.
So Katie, I mean, the teams moved across, didn't they, from
Yes.
David Frost's Europe unit into the Foreign Office to support Liz Truss? I mean, are the officials very visible in Northern Ireland?
No.
Get the sense?
No. But I would say, so for example, Liz Truss coming to Northern Ireland and then not meeting all the political parties in the executive, that's very bad because of the nature of power sharing. So even if Unionists are vocal in their concerns and have genuine concerns, and it is very important for them to meet the Foreign Secretary, it's equally important for her to speak to the other members of the executive as well. And also the tweeting of promotional standpoint from the UK government and their views around the problems of the protocol in relation to a visit. It's a very peculiar thing, if you think about it, for a government minister to make a visit to part of the UK into something that's then I won't use the word propaganda, but it was a very strange video, and the Minister for Europe did the same thing, just emphasising the problems, which doesn't feel like it's aimed at the people of Northern Ireland to reassure them that they are working on these problems in negotiation with the EU. I think there needs to be a step change in order to take it out of the sphere of the politicking and the rhetoric and the hyperbole around it, and to actually reassure people that there is there is hope of there being a negotiated outcome that they will agree on. The joint statements between Liz Truss and Šefčovič have been very important. There's a long way to go yet in order to kind of get that stability that is needed. And just to sort of pick up on this question of whether we're in limbo before the election, the hope would be yet that there could be something to calm the waters a little bit. Because it's a long way yet to the election, and there's an awful lot of genuine anxieties around what might happen, and they may well be fed into the election if there's something that could be done beforehand to reassure people that that it is possible for the UK and the EU to have an agreement, even on medicines or some things that most worry people. That helps them have confidence going to the election that there might yet be.
You don't think we're in a position that, I mean, we were always told during the negotiations themselves that nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. And obviously the July command paper put forward a quite substantial revisiting of the protocol, if not a sort of switching the defaults. Do you get the sense you could, is there appetite? Do you get any sense for saying, well, let's move a few things out of the pending tray into the done tray? Do you think that's feasible?
Well, let's bear in mind there'll be continual bargaining. This is a really, really complicated document, and it will have implications that evolve over time for Northern Ireland. So there will continually be issues that they need to agree upon and make decisions on. So there's never going to be a point at which you say, well, that's done and we can just wash our hands of it. So to get into the habit of, making, having agreements, clarifying issues, giving information on the progress made and what is agreed, that would go a long way towards, as I say, calming the waters, as I think is necessary before the election.
And Raoul, I want to pick up those points, but I want to throw another couple at you about the pressures on Liz Truss. I always thought that, Foreign Office, Foreign Secretary was quite a busy job when she was asked to take on this, and the Northern Ireland Protocol is quite detailed. So there's always a bit of a bandwidth question. Since then, we have, crisis turning into war in Ukraine, the UK making quite a lot of the need to cooperate with European partners. I wondered whether that would affect at all the way the government might be approaching that. Conversely, of course, we have, though slightly forgotten, receded, Partygate rumbling on in the background, the Met Police investigation, the possibility that we might go into yet another Conservative leadership battle, and Liz Truss potentially as a contender looking for support. And we know that there's quite a substantial faction on the Conservative backbenches who are not fans of the protocol, and we're looking for a tough line from whoever aspires to be next Prime Minister. So how on earth do those different pressures potentially play out? Or actually, is this just really, let's just laser-like focus on the detail of what the section on medicine says and how I'm going to negotiate SBS checks?
Well, I think, to pick up that last point and tie into some of the points Katie made, I think Liz Truss in particular sees this as a much more political negotiation. So that is why there has been more politics involved. Yes, there are technical negotiations going on, but they are mostly at an impasse. Like the two sides go to each other, they present their their positions, and they are a long way apart. And the EU side says, well, this is what EU law means. DG Sante is there saying, well, these are all the health regulations on the food you have to meet. And the UK side goes and says, well, these are how we need to completely change how the border works between GB and Northern Ireland. And the gap is massive. So yes, improved tone and all of that, but you know, we shouldn't forget the gaps are still very large. And so I think, yeah, Liz's approach is very much this should be a more political negotiation. I think, you know, in terms of, and so all of that I think means it is going to run longer. And I don't see there is. I mean, first of all, the gaps are big technically, but even if you could do something before the election, I personally think, you know, the risk is it would become. It would be a bit of a almost waste of some potential compromise, because the DUP in particular, I don't see ahead of the election would have any incentive to even, you know, accept it or live with it in any way. You know, we know they're tacking towards a TUV vote to try and stop what they see as a bleeding into that. How real that is, etc., we can question, but that seems to be their position. So they're never gonna support, you know, even something minimal on customs ahead of the election, I think. And so there is a risk you put it on the table, it gets knocked down, and then it's hard to come back to it afterwards. Whereas I think if you come to it after the election, when more things might be in play, maybe it's more realistic. I don't know. So I just think I think there are lots of reasons why something won't happen ahead of the election. I mean, on the point about Conservative and the leadership, and I mean, first of all, obviously Liz does have a lot on, and the Foreign Secretary is a very significant role, and at the moment, I mean, I don't think there is going to be a particularly significant read across from the UK-EU cooperation on Ukraine to the improved moods or anything like that in terms of the protocol, unfortunately. You know, if anything, the two sides are at loggerheads on the protocol now, and they're proving they can work perfectly well together on the Ukraine sanctions. So, you know, I don't see that changing much, unfortunately. In terms of the potential leadership contest and the ongoing rumblings, obviously that will come to a head at some point, whether it's post the local elections or the Met inquiry. From Liz's perspective, as you said, whether there is any incentive on her to compromise given the views of the ERG and that side of the party, I think the question would be, you know, where else do they have to go other than supporting Liz? And that's the best hope that she feels, you know, actually they are going to be backing her if there is a leadership contest, if that happens, regardless, and therefore maybe she has more space than others to make a compromise. I think that's the most optimistic reading I can give. I'm not sure that's true, but that would be the optimistic reading.
Well, can I just come back to you? I mean, you are Director of Trade and Investment in Deloitte. We saw some sort of suggestions from the polling that there is, you know, some people in Northern Ireland really have bought into this sort of best of both. If we could get over some of these little local difficulties, there is a best of both worlds, which quite a lot of people thought in selling the protocol, where Northern Ireland can benefit from its dual access to the GB internal market and the EU's single market. Do you get any sign in your day job at Deloitte that actually there is anything in that there is a potential for that? That's a question from Anonymous.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. I think around the time the protocol was agreed and in sort of, you know, 2020, there was initially some interest, and I think particularly in the heavily regulated sectors, you know, I think pharma and some other heavily regulated sectors particularly saw the potential benefits. I think that has unfortunately dropped off just due to the instability and uncertainty. You know, we've got this informal standstill. No one knows when and if that will end. So you can't really invest and make, you know, big supply chain decisions or location decisions without knowing that. And then you don't know what will come afterwards. You know, you don't know if it's going to be the full protocol or if it's going to be something else. So I think that level of uncertainty, and then obviously we have the election and whether there will be, you know, an executive and assembly back up, and the added general uncertainty there, the inability to pass a budget, you know, all these things are then contributing to quite a, unfortunately, negative sort of investment environment, I guess, in Northern Ireland, sadly. So, yeah, I think there was interest, and I think there could be interest again, but I think the conditions of wider political stability and a bit more certainty are obviously kind of fundamental, as with any kind of investment climate.
Yeah. Katie, we've got some questions actually on the polling itself, so I just wanted to put her questions on you. One question, which is probably from Anonymous, yes it is, excellent, is to what extent you can distinguish between attitudes towards Brexit and attitudes in general and attitudes to the protocol in particular is basically just this, a replay of leave remain. And then a question from Alistair Jones, thanks very much Alistair for declaring yourself, has asked whether we can say anything about the attitudes in different communities. And I want to come back to, is this going to be a protocol election? Is, you know, if it's unresolved, is there any prospect that the executive will get up and running? But I want to come to you after that. But just those questions on the polling, what do we, what, is this just basically Brexit continues to play out and views are pretty entrenched? And just to an extent, as we see, I think when John Curtis presents his results for the UK, he shows a bit of a drift from undecided to, well, actually, I should have probably voted to stay. And that's the big change rather than people changing their mind. Is that what we're really seeing in Northern Ireland as well?
Yeah, so, I mean, it is hard to differentiate between the impact of Brexit and the impact of the protocol. So we've been careful in our phrasing of the questions. And then when you look down in terms of the responses to the polls from different groups, and we haven't published on this yet, but just the sort of the headline findings would be, yes, you can see a difference. It's not so much Unionist nationalists, but Remain voters and others more broadly. But there is, so if you look at the sort of the hardline positions, hardline sort of strong Unionists, strong nationalists, almost mirror opposites in their views on the protocol. But there's a big middle ground, of course. They don't represent the majority of people on either side. So, and that's where the interesting stuff is. And you do see the significance of some Unionist identity there. But on certain questions, there is a difference, particularly amongst those who call themselves sort of softer Unionists. So you can see the potential there for movement, as David said.
And one of the things we've seen in Northern Ireland over the past few years is a rise of support for alliance, people who don't identify particularly with Derek Mooney's asked a question about the, asked whether by focusing on Unionist nationalist positions, are we missing the point, the biggest single cohort in NI politics today? He said that, you can comment on that. Today is other, neither Unionist nor nationalist. Are we missing those people?
So they are the plurality of people say they're neither Unionist nor nationalist, according to Northern Ireland Life and Times, but obviously that's not reflected in the support for non-aligned parties. We did see Alliance doing particularly well as a non-aligned, leading non-aligned party in 2019. I would suspect that's largely because of the sort of the pro-Remain, pro-second referendum, remember those days, sentiment behind support for Alliance then. This will be a critical election for them. To see whether they can translate. I don't think it'll, see, the question is, will it be about the protocol and people voting support for Alliance this time, or will it be other issues? And as I say, there's many, many other issues that are much more urgent and pressing for many people in Northern Ireland. And those are the ones that most people would support Alliance for, or the Green Party or other parties, you know. So will this be a possibility of an election getting to those kind of issues? Or will it be caught up with concentration on the protocol and its connection to the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, which is a big turn-off for many people. And just to pick up on Ra's point about, you know, the politics of it all, I mean, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the majority of people are saying that if the UK and EU can't agree solutions soon, this is posing a risk to peace and stability in Northern Ireland. So no matter whatever is going on in the internal dynamics of the Conservative Party or in the UK-EU relationship, this is of concern, and it's of most concern to Unionists in particular. I mean, we mustn't lose sight of that. So even if it's a small little step, that would be something that would make a big difference, at least to the atmosphere, I think.
So Raoul suggested that there's sort of no prospect of anything, any deal before the election, and we've got various comments saying, is this a protocol election? We know we have the consent vote scheduled for 2024, and you've asked people, you know, will that determine how they vote, how their MLA is likely to vote? So just a question, you know, if we go for another couple of months of stasis, have May elections, is there any prospect of a protocol, of an executive reforming after that, with the protocol still in the pending tray, or does this mean Northern Ireland's going to have quite a long period again with a sort of not no functioning executive, but a sort of low functioning executive when we see the in tray of other decisions, you know, health backlogs and things like that, just mounting and mounting and mounting, and dissatisfaction in Northern Ireland with the failure of the executive to get to grips with some of these, you know, bread and butter politics.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we've got used to a low functioning executive, and we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we don't have a functioning executive now because purportedly of the protocol. And we're going to have a long time without a proper functioning executive with major consequences, including a lack of decision on a budget, for example. And I'll let others come in on this one, but there is a serious concern that this could be a really bruising election, and we could end up with no executive being formed, and the protocol being right there at the centre of the issues, which we all know Northern Ireland's politicians have very little influence over in actual fact. So despite the lack of trust on both sides, the future of power sharing and therefore of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement feels very much at stake here. And yet there's a sort of powerlessness that's kind of very acute as people are coming into this new election.
David, how do you see that? Do you think?
Okay, I think one thing we need to remember is that whereas the protocol is a significant issue for a good number of people, we did ask how they ranked it in the polling. Equally, for 44% of people, it's ranked in the bottom 3 of the 10 issues we put forward to them. What is really exercising minds and what is really concerned is like the future of the health service, is the economic situation. I think it's 2/3 see the NHS as being the most important issue. Constitutional future for Northern Ireland is for 43% of people in the top 3 issue. Now, I think one of the issues we probably want to try and unpack a little bit is to what extent is the constitutional question partly reflection of the protocol. But I think, we shouldn't overstate the way in which the protocol, or shouldn't assume that the protocol is dominating political debate in Northern Ireland. It's very prominent, but equally for a good number of people, it's not the top concern for them. I think just going back to this point that people in Northern Ireland feeling most helpless in this, I think there is a sense that they are, because there are certain things that the UK government could do to potentially move us on towards some sort of resolution. The whole question of regulatory alignment on SPS. Okay, we had a reasonable discussion about that a year ago. When we did some polling on it, we saw majority support in Northern Ireland saying, we should do that in order to facilitate or to reduce the friction on the movement between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That's a potential solution there, but I think for obviously ideological political reasons, it's not something that the UK government wants to go.
But it's very difficult, isn't it, when you have a new Minister for Brexit Opportunities who is there to speed up regulatory divergence, delivering that Brexit dividend, and doing that which, and some of the areas, consultation on gene editing and things like that, you see directly in the SBS line.
But I suppose it doesn't necessarily have to be across the board. It's in those areas where the protocol keeps Northern Ireland aligned to EU law. And you can always do it on a temporary basis with some of the...
I mean, I think
I'm going to ask you all where you think the landing zones are. So...
Yeah, I mean, I wish that the
lots
sort of partial...
questions about, how we take in the interest, SBS, medicines, etc., etc. So...
Yeah, I mean, I think I wish the partial kind of approach would have worked, but, in my experience in the negotiations, the EU has been steadfast in rejecting any kind of salami slicing and partial, we align with only certain blocks. It would either be, yes, you can do full across the board agricultural SPS alignment, like, Switzerland, which I think, as you said, the UK government isn't going to do for political reasons. So I think there isn't much in that space. There are other more creative potential solutions, around whether it's managed divergence or a temporary kind of alignment. I think potentially there is something there, but again, that's something that, neither side has been willing to really look at in the past 5 or 6 years. So whether anything will change now, I'm not sure. And I think there is, to be honest, I think there is a lack of ideas on both sides about where we go now. And that kind of is, to me, why I feel actually almost my most pessimistic I've been for quite some time about this, because there just isn't obvious to me what the landing zone is. And unfortunately, you gave me a billing at the start that I have identified landing zones, but I don't quite see it at the moment. That I have, but in previous parts of this negotiation, I have at least had some sense of where we could go. At this stage, I'm struggling. So, yeah, it is quite difficult, and the two sides are just very entrenched in their respective positions, and the gaps are significant. Yeah, I think there isn't going to be, let's see post-election whether there will be more creativity. I mean, I guess the one thing we haven't mentioned about the election is just how much of a landmark shift this election could be with, if the polls are to be believed, Sinn Féin becoming the largest party. That is something which is really going to change the nature of the debate, and, regardless of the protocol, whether power sharing can and will return and all of that is going to be a huge question. So, yeah, I think regardless of that, this election will be a pretty significant one for Northern Ireland.
So I'm just very interested. James Crisp from The Telegraph has actually asked exactly that, and he asked me to put it to you, Raoul, about what difference Sinn Féin taking the First Minister. We know that First Minister and Deputy First Minister are basically the same job, but have different names and very different optics, and we've never had a Sinn Féin First Minister before. Does that make things much, much more difficult for a UK government to be seen to be giving airtime to a Sinn Féin First Minister, cutting deals, or are they more pragmatic than that?
I mean, it does make things difficult. I'm not sure. I think it is just particularly difficult for the formation of the executive and getting that back up and running. I think that, look, the DUP have obviously made some questionable strategic choices over the past few years, you could say, in my view. But, so where they will go after this, I'm not sure. And I think it really poses some difficult choices for them and for the wider, I guess, unionist groupings who, as Katie said, obviously don't always have the aligned same view. So, well, for the UK government, yes, it will make it difficult. I mean, it is always tricky. Look, I think things have reached a stage where there is, at least around the protocol, a reasonable acceptance in terms of working with the two communities and trying to find that cross-community support. So I don't think it's impossible. But I think a lot will hinge on, can we get an executive and assembly up and running? To me, I think that will take some time, and therefore, particularly on the protocol, I don't think the UK government is going to take, action until that happens. I'm not sure, it's reasonable to ask the UK government to implement the protocol over and above in Northern Ireland when, I imagine Sinn Féin won't like the idea of things being directed from Westminster, and the DUP and others won't like the idea of the protocol being implemented above the head when they don't agree with it. So I think we're going to be at quite a difficult stage in terms of how the UK government approaches that, given its obligations under the protocol.
Jess, any landing zones in sight?
Yeah, I'd like to be a little bit more optimistic.
Yeah, sorry about that.
In just that I think we do need to appreciate how far we've come. I think we are closer to agreement than we were perhaps 6 months ago. And I think there is something here in this principle that goods going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland and staying in Northern Ireland should be treated a bit differently, whether that's a reduction in the frequency of checks or the removal of them entirely. We have got a lot closer to a kind of agreed position there. I do think one of the barriers is just the practical challenges of trying to create a scheme, even if you agree with the principle, that is robust enough to prevent it being abused and to create problems for the single market, but also permissive enough that it doesn't create a whole lot of paperwork for businesses that want to use it, and therefore kind of undermines the whole point of it. And I think it's worth saying that the UK government, with the protocol governs trade that's moving from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, but the UK government has discretion over goods that are going from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, and it itself has committed to design a similar scheme and is struggling to do that as well. So even where it has complete control of the kind of requirements on goods, it's difficult. It's a really hard thing to do. So I think fundamentally, it's going to require some level of political compromise and an increase in trust, because when you're operationalising a scheme like this, there does need to be trust between the different parties. And I do think we're getting closer to a position where that might be possible. I think the big barrier to that is these issues that I mentioned at the beginning that aren't under discussion at the moment. So the European Court of Justice, state aid, and if the UK government is going to insist that they are absolute red lines, then to be honest, it's really difficult to see there being agreement. But, as the Queen's poll polling shows very clearly, for people in Northern Ireland, their concern are those practical issues that have an impact on trade and supply chains, not perhaps the more kind of fundamental principle issues like the role of the European Court of Justice. So I hope that's not a barrier to resolving some of those practical issues.
And Katie and David, your polling shows some shifting of opinion in Northern Ireland towards a sort of softening of views towards, but some of the questions we've had is there a prospect of stability, you know, if there's not a single unionist MLA who's pro-protocol, maybe that's a single DUP MLA, but can you see a landing zone for the protocol ultimately where that unionism can live with and see as securing its future in the union as opposed to the reverse?
Longer term, potentially. I think, as the polling shows, divisions exist, and the differences in the opposition to the protocol is persistent across those polls. So it's not going to go away. And obviously, there are political forces in Northern Ireland who are trying to exploit the opposition to the protocol, which clearly exists. I think a lot depends on the extent to which we can see what I would see it as movement over the last year towards a more solutions-focused approach. I think we've moved beyond where we were with the command paper, which it's got to all be renegotiated. It's looking about how you can actually find solutions. I think the point that Jess made there is really important. You can focus on the issues which are of interest and concern to people in Northern Ireland and demonstrate that those can be resolved. Then I think you might be able to get more buy-in. But I think we're a long way from getting that cross-community support for the protocol. So I'd expect the vote into 2024 to revealing many of the divisions we currently see in politics in Northern Ireland around the protocol.
Katie, do you want to end on a more optimistic note?
So I think in terms of the principles, so we know Northern Ireland is divided in ideological terms over principles related to the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. So as long as the protocol is in that sphere, including in language from the British government, the more difficult it will be to have a landing space that is accepted. But for the majority of people, especially businesses, of course, this isn't a point of principle or ideology. It is about the pragmatics and about making do. And I think the more that both sides, UK and the EU, directly engage with people in Northern Ireland, business and civil society, the more you get the evidence you need to be making good decisions. And they will not, I mean, these are really technical, boring stuff that have direct implications for movement of goods, etc. So the more you get that direct feed in to the discussions, I think the more hope there is of having a sort of a long-term de-dramatisation of the protocol and ultimately making it work.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Long-term de-dramatisation of the protocol, perhaps. Anyway, so thank you very, very much to our panel, Katie Hayward and David Finnemore over from Belfast, Raoul and Jess, who've come less far, but thank you so much for all your contributions, so we thank them, and thank you all very much for watching, and many apologies for all the brilliant questions that Anonymous submitted that I failed to get to, so thank you all very much.